heart of Melbourne, at the corner of Victoria and Franklin Streets, stands a striking memorial, a contemporary artwork by Brooke Andrew and Trent Walter. It marks the spot near where two Aboriginal men, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer, were hanged in 1842, the first executions carried out by the colonial government in Melbourne. More than just a monument, this artwork challenges us to confront a difficult truth, that Australia's foundations were laid not only on settlement, but on resistance, violence, and voices that were nearly erased. This is their story, a story that still echoes through Melbourne's streets today. The public hangings of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer on the 20th of January, 1842 were among the gravest injustices in Australian history. These two Aboriginal men became the first people executed by the colonial authorities in the Port Phillip district, not because justice was served, but because justice was denied. They were hanged for the killing of two white sealers, but their side of the story, the suffering they endured and the reasons behind their resistance, was ignored by the courts. Their execution was not a triumph of law and order, it was a brutal silencing of Aboriginal voices. The story of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer is a story that should shake any human heart. It's a story of colonial violence, of a people pushed to the edge, and of two men who stood up and paid with their lives. European colonisation of this continent brought with it widespread displacement, destruction, and trauma for the Aboriginal people. While Australia's colonial history may not have mirrored the full scale of genocide seen elsewhere, it was nonetheless a devastating war for survival. And in that war, there were few who stood for Aboriginal rights, and many more who enforced dispossession. In Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, European sealers began commercial operations in 1798. Just 5 years later, in 1803, a permanent British military post was established in Hobart. What followed were some of the darkest chapters in Australia's history. The violence against Aboriginal Tasmanians was relentless. Settlers, especially the sealers, raided Aboriginal communities, often kidnapping women and children. With a severe shortage of European women in the colony, many settlers turned to abduction and sexual violence, crimes that were widespread and rarely punished. Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer had lived through this terror. They had seen their people hunted, their families torn apart, and their country taken by force. By the time they arrived in Melbourne in 1841, they were no longer just witnesses to injustice, they were active resistors against it. The violence inflicted on Aboriginal communities in Van Diemen's Land was savage and systematic. Women and children were raped, many were taken as sex slaves, while others were simply shot dead. Some settlers even treated killing Aboriginal people as sport. As Aboriginal resistance began to grow, settlers responded with brutal force. What followed was not just retaliation, it was organized, collective punishment aimed at crushing an entire people. By the 1820s, the conflict had escalated to an all-out war. The settler response to Aboriginal resistance was indiscriminate and merciless. Entire communities were wiped out. The mass killings that followed over the next decade were nothing short of a genocide. Lieutenant Governor George Arthur responded to the unrest by declaring martial law, effectively granting settlers legal immunity to kill Aboriginal people without consequence. In the 1830s, the colonial government launched the infamous Black Line, a 6-week military operation aimed at removing Aboriginal people from Tasmania's settled districts. Over 2,200 soldiers and civilians formed a human chain, sweeping through the landscape in a massive coordinated push. Hundreds of Aboriginal people were killed or driven from their lands. Bounties were even paid for each Aboriginal person captured or killed. In the same decade, a man named George Augustus Robinson was appointed as the so-called protector of Aborigines. He promised sanctuary on Flinders Island, urging Aboriginal people to surrender their weapons and relocate peacefully. But Robinson's promises were hollow. Though he gained the trust of several Aboriginal leaders, including Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer, he became known as a wolf in sheep's clothing. His strategy was to pacify resistance through persuasion, while the machinery of colonization continued unhindered. Those who accepted his offer were exiled from their homelands, stripped of their culture, and left to suffer in squalid conditions. In 1839, George Augustus Robinson was appointed Chief Protector of Aborigines in the Port Phillip district, modern-day Victoria. Believing he could replicate his success in Tasmania, he brought with him a group of 16 Tasmanian Aboriginal people to assist in his new role. Among them were Truganini, her husband Wurrudi, Paitaruna, Planabina, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer. Robinson used Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer as intermediaries to communicate with Aboriginal clans around Melbourne. Through this work, the young men would have seen with painful clarity that the same pattern of dispossession, violence, and deception that destroyed their homeland was now unfolding on the mainland. Eventually, the disillusionment grew too great. The group split from Robinson. Tunnerminnerwait, Maulboyheenneer, Truganini, and 2 Aboriginal women left Melbourne, carrying supplies and taking to the bush. It's likely they were trying to find their way back to Tasmania, their homeland, navigating through dense country with few allies and many dangers. Their journey took them through the Dandenong Ranges, and eventually toward Wilson's Promontory. Along the way, they raided outlying settler camps, collected weapons, and destroyed property, striking back at a system that had stolen everything from them. In late 1841, at Wilson's Promontory, the group encountered 2 white whalers. Shots were fired. One man was killed instantly. The other was reportedly clubbed to death. Whether the killings were acts of self-defense or retribution remains unclear. But colonial justice wasn't interested in context. Within 6 weeks, the group was captured by police. They were brought back to Melbourne to face trial, not before a jury of their peers, but in a legal system still in its infancy, governed by laws they never agreed to and in a language they barely understood. The trial of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer was closely followed by the press. For the colonial authorities, it was about more than punishing 2 men. It was about sending a clear message to the Aboriginal people of Victoria: resistance would be met with the full force of British law. Despite the deep injustice at the heart of the case, the court made no effort to understand the men's motives, nor to consider the years of trauma that had shaped their actions. The law was cold, rigid, and merciless, and the verdict was death. On the morning of the 20th of January, 1842, thousands of people gathered in Melbourne to witness the hanging. The execution took place near the corner of Trobe and Spencer Streets, in what was then a quiet edge of the settlement. The newspapers referred to the men simply as Bob and Jack, English nicknames stripped of their true identities, their heritage, and their story. Even today, it remains unclear which name referred to whom. It is assumed that Tunnerminnerwait was nicknamed Bob. But that confusion only underscores the greater tragedy, the dehumanization of 2 Aboriginal men who had dared to resist. Their deaths marked the first executions in Melbourne carried out by the colonial government, and they were meant to serve as a spectacle, a warning, and a statement of power. Redmond Barry served as the defense lawyer for Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer. Barry questioned the legal basis of British authority over Aborigines, whose citizens were not, and claimed that the evidence was dubious and circumstantial. Despite his best efforts, the 2 men were found guilty and subsequently hanged on the 20th of January, 1842, becoming the first people in Victoria to be legally executed. Those who understand what Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer had lived through, the memory of that day is not one of justice, it is one of profound sorrow. The execution of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer was not just a punishment, it was a spectacle. A report published in the Australasian Chronicle on the 15th of February, 1842 described the scene in haunting detail. It was the first capital punishment carried out in Port Phillip since European settlement, and it attracted morbid curiosity from all corners of Melbourne. Over 3,000 people gathered to witness the event. Trees were climbed, rooftops were packed, and even the prisoners' coffins were stood on by spectators desperate for a better view. Women made up a large part of the crowd, some even dressed for the occasion, as if attending a public performance. The two men, referred to only by the colonial nicknames Bob and Jack, had been held in the Melbourne jail following their conviction. During their final days, visitors poured in, government officials, missionaries, and onlookers, all hoping to witness a glimpse of remorse, redemption, or perhaps just raw human emotion. According to the report, Tunnerminnerwait grew increasingly distraught. He broke down in tears, trembled, moaned in fear, and could barely speak through the anxiety that consumed him. He refused food, and when finally forced to climb the scaffold ladder, hands tied, he struggled, needing to be pushed and pulled to the platform. His last hours were filled with agony. Maulboyheenneer, by contrast, remained eerily calm. He ate, smoked his pipe, and refused to show fear. The night before his death, he is said to have confessed, he killed the whalers for revenge, believing that in death, he would be reunited with his father as a hunter in the afterlife. He rejected the Christian messages offered to him and asked to keep his eyes uncovered until the very end. As the execution approached, the scaffold revealed its horrors. The platform was unstable and poorly constructed. With no hands to climb, the men were forced to crawl up the ladder with their knees and chins, a public humiliation on top of a public death. A witness called the scene a gross outrage of public decency. Even the hangman had to be bribed, offered £10 and a transfer to another district, because no one in Melbourne wanted the job. When the moment came, the platform dropped with a clumsy jolt. Tunnerminnerwait cried out. Maulboyheenneer stayed silent. But because of a mechanical failure, Tunnerminnerwait's rope slipped slightly. He struggled longer, his legs shaking, his pain prolonged. At last, they hung still. Their bodies were left for an hour, then taken down, placed in coffins, and buried near the cemetery north of the town, no marker, no ceremony. The Australasian Chronicle noted the sharp contrast between the two men. Tunnerminnerwait was described as lively and capable of affection, a man torn by guilt and fear in his final moments. Maulboyheenneer was called sullen but daring, resolute and unmoved to the end. Yet the report also revealed something deeper, that both men had once trusted George Augustus Robinson, followed him faithfully, and had even saved white lives before choosing the path of resistance. Their transformation, from trusted guides to condemned criminals, tells a much larger story. A story not only of two men, but of a people who watched their land taken, their families destroyed, and their futures stolen, and who, in the face of such loss, chose to resist. The hanging of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenneer was meant to send a warning, but history has turned it into a witness. A witness to the violence and injustice inflicted upon Aboriginal people. A witness to a legal system that served the powerful and silenced the oppressed. And a witness to the quiet courage of two men who, in their final moments, refused to be broken in the way colonisation had broken so many others. They were the first to be executed by the European authorities in Melbourne, but they were not the first to resist. And they would not be the last. For over a century, their story was forgotten by most, buried like their bodies, without a name, without a stone. But today, their memory has been reclaimed.